August 10, 1966. Huntsville, Texas. The execution chamber is silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. James French is strapped to the electric chair, leather restraints biting into his wrists. The warden asks if he has any last words. French looks directly at the witnesses, and instead of crying or begging for mercy, he smiles. Then he says something so shocking that newspapers across America will print it the very next day. His words? How about this for a headline? French fries. The room freezes. Some witnesses gasp. Others look away in disgust. But French? He's laughing. Actually laughing as 2,000 volts of electricity course through his body. What kind of man jokes at his own execution? And what led him to this moment? The answer is darker than you could ever imagine. Before we dive into the twisted story of James French, if you're into dark true crime cases that'll keep you up at night, you need to subscribe right now. 90% of you watching aren't subscribed, and you're missing out on cases like this every single week. Hit that like button too, because it helps us cover more stories the mainstream media won't touch. Now, let's get back to the man who turned his execution into a punchline. James French was born in 1936 in rural Oklahoma, right in the heart of the Dust Bowl aftermath. His childhood was anything but normal. His father was an alcoholic who disappeared for weeks at a time, and his mother worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. By age 12, French was already stealing cars and breaking into homes. But he wasn't some master criminal. He was sloppy, desperate, and angry at a world that had given him nothing. At 14, he dropped out of school. By 16, he was arrested for armed robbery. The judge gave him a choice: military service or juvenile detention. French chose the military, thinking it might straighten him out. It didn't. He was discharged within a year for insubordination and violent behavior. By 1958, at just 22 years old, James French had already been in and out of jail 7 times. But his next crime would change everything. February 13, 1958. French is hitchhiking along a desolate highway outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma. A man named Eldon Frazier pulls over, a kind-hearted motorist just trying to help a stranger. They drive for 30 miles, making small talk. Then, without warning, French pulls out a knife. He doesn't ask for money. He doesn't threaten Frazier. He just starts stabbing. 7 times. Frazier's car swerves off the road and crashes into a ditch. French leaves him there, bleeding out in the driver's seat, and takes his wallet. He got away with $43. That's it. $43 for a man's life. Frazier died before anyone found him. French was arrested 3 days later at a gas station, still driving the dead man's car. At trial, he showed no remorse. When asked why he did it, French shrugged and said, "I needed the money." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty. First-degree murder. But here's where it gets strange. French didn't get the death penalty. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison at Oklahoma State Penitentiary. For most killers, that would be the end of the story. But for James French, it was just the beginning. Oklahoma State Penitentiary in the 1950s was a hellhole. Overcrowded, violent, and crawling with gangs. French was thrown into general population with no protection, no friends, and a target on his back. Other inmates saw him as weak, an outsider who didn't belong to any crew. He was beaten within his first week. Twice. Guards did nothing. They rarely did. French spent his days in the prison workshop, making license plates for 12 cents an hour. At night, he lay awake in his cell, listening to the screams of other inmates being shanked or raped in the darkness. Months turned into years. French started to lose his mind. He wrote letters to the parole board, begging for release. All denied. He tried to escape once, hiding in a laundry cart. He was caught before he even made it to the gate. They threw him in solitary confinement for 6 months. When he came out, something inside him had snapped. He told another inmate, "I'm never getting out of here alive." That inmate didn't realize French meant it literally. By 1961, James French had been in prison for 3 years. He had no hope of parole, no family that cared, and no future beyond those concrete walls. So he made a decision. He was going to die, but not by his own hand. French had tried to kill himself twice already, once by hanging, once by slashing his wrists, but guards found him both times. Suicide watch meant he'd never succeed. So he came up with a different plan. He would make the state kill him. In the 1960s, Oklahoma still had the death penalty. If French committed another murder inside prison, he'd be executed. It was the only way out. But there was one problem. He needed a victim. Someone vulnerable. Someone who wouldn't fight back. And then, one day in the prison cafeteria, he found him. Eddie Shelton, a fellow inmate. Quiet. Harmless. Shelton was serving time for check fraud, a nonviolent offense. He kept to himself, read books, and never caused trouble. He had a wife and 2 kids waiting for him on the outside. In 6 months, he was up for parole. 6 months. French didn't care. June 6, 1961. The prison yard. Shelton is sitting alone on a bench, reading a letter from his daughter. French walks up behind him, carrying a sharpened screwdriver he'd stolen from the workshop. No words. No hesitation. He drives the weapon into Shelton's neck. Once. Twice. 3 times. Blood sprays across the concrete. Inmates scatter, screaming. Guards rush in, tackling French to the ground. Shelton collapses, gasping for air. He dies before the ambulance even arrives. French doesn't resist. He drops the screwdriver, holds out his wrists, and smiles at the guards. "I got what I wanted," he says. The entire prison goes on lockdown. Investigators swarm the yard. They interview witnesses, collect evidence, and try to understand why French did it. When detectives ask him directly, French tells them the truth. "I wanted the death penalty. I couldn't kill myself, so I made you do it." The confession is chilling, cold, calculated. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a suicide by execution. French is immediately transferred to death row at Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Unlike general population, death row is different. Isolated. Quiet. Each inmate has their own cell. No contact with others, except during brief exercise periods. French loves it. For the first time in years, he feels at peace. He knows what's coming, and he's ready for it. He spends his days writing letters to newspapers, cracking jokes with guards, and reading crime novels. Other death row inmates hate him. They're fighting for their lives, filing appeals, begging for clemency. French? He's counting down the days until they strap him to the chair. His trial is quick. The evidence is overwhelming. Dozens of witnesses. A signed confession. The jury returns a guilty verdict in under an hour. The judge sentences him to death by electrocution. French's attorney tries to file an appeal anyway, but French fires him. "I don't want an appeal," he says in court. "I want to die." The judge asks if he's sure. French nods. Positive. The execution is scheduled for August 10, 1966. French has 4 years to wait. But he's patient. He knows the end is near. Death row in the 1960s is a waiting game. Some inmates spend decades there, their cases tied up in endless legal battles. But French isn't like them. He refuses all appeals, all lawyer visits, all attempts to delay his execution. He becomes something of a celebrity among the guards. They call him Smiley, because he's always grinning, always joking, even when other inmates are sobbing in their cells. One guard later said, "French was the happiest man on death row." It was unsettling. French passes the time by writing. Not appeals or pleas for mercy, but jokes. Dark, twisted jokes about death and execution. He mails them to newspapers, hoping they'll print them. Most don't, but a few do, and French becomes known as the condemned comedian. He writes to his mother once. She never writes back. He doesn't care. He has no attachment to the outside world anymore. Prison is all he knows, and death is all he wants. March 1963. A riot breaks out in the main prison yard. Inmates are angry about overcrowding and poor conditions. They take 2 guards hostage, demanding better treatment. The warden calls in state police. Tear gas fills the air. Gunshots echo through the prison. 5 inmates are killed. 12 are injured. Death row is locked down for 2 weeks. No visitors, no phone calls, no exercise. French is furious. Not because of a lockdown, but because the riot delays executions. 2 other inmates were scheduled to die before him, and now their dates are pushed back. They're slowing down the line. French complains to a guard. The guard stares at him, speechless. Most men would be relieved by a delay. Not French. He wants to die, and he wants to die now. But there's nothing he can do. He's at the mercy of the system. So he waits, and waits, and waits. By 1965, French has been on death row for 4 years. His mental state is deteriorating. He's angrier, more erratic. He gets into fights with other inmates during exercise periods. He throws food at guards. He smashes his cell's toilet, flooding the entire block. The warden threatens to put him in solitary confinement, but French doesn't care. "Just execute me already," he screams through the bars. Other inmates start avoiding him. Even hardened killers find French disturbing. There's something wrong with a man who wants to die. One inmate, a convicted serial killer, later said, "French scared me more than anyone I've ever met. He had nothing to lose." The guards agree. They start doing random cell checks on French, worried he'll find a way to kill himself before the state can do it. But French is smarter than that. He's waited this long. He can wait a little longer. His execution date is finally confirmed. August 10, 1966. Less than a year away. French marks each day on his cell wall with a piece of chalk. He's counting down. Real quick, if you're still watching this, you need to hit that subscribe button. I post cases like this every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. Also, drop a comment and let me know. Do you think French deserves sympathy, or was he beyond redemption? I read every comment. Now back to the story, because what happens next will leave you speechless. June 1966. 2 months before the execution. French is interviewed by a prison psychologist, standard procedure for death row inmates. The psychologist asks French if he has any regrets. French laughs. "My only regret is that I didn't kill Shelton sooner." The psychologist notes that French shows classic signs of antisocial personality disorder. No empathy. No remorse. No fear. When asked if he's afraid of dying, French shakes his head. "I'm more afraid of living." The psychologist recommends a psychiatric evaluation, suggesting French might be mentally unfit for execution. But French refuses. "I'm perfectly sane," he insists. "I just don't want to be here anymore." The evaluation is dropped. The execution moves forward. French's last meal request is filed. A cheeseburger, fries, and a chocolate milkshake. Simple. Unremarkable. Just like the man himself. July 1966. 1 month to go. French starts planning his final act. He knows the execution will be witnessed by reporters, prison officials, and maybe even Shelton's family. He wants to leave an impression. Not as a monster, but as a man who went out on his own terms. He practices his final words in his cell, whispering them to himself late at night. Some are serious. Some are defiant. But one sticks out. How about this for a headline? French fries. It's dark. It's absurd. It's perfect. French knows the media will eat it up. They love a spectacle, and he's going to give them one. He tells a guard about his plan. The guard thinks he's joking. "You're really going to say that?" French grins. "You'll see." August 9, 1966. The night before the execution. French is moved to a holding cell near the execution chamber. He can hear the hum of the electric chair being tested in the next room. Most inmates break down at this point, crying, praying, or begging for mercy. Not French. He eats his last meal in silence, savoring every bite. He showers, shaves, and puts on the clean clothes provided by the prison. A chaplain visits, offering to pray with him. French declines. "I'm good," he says. The chaplain leaves, shaking his head. French lies on his cot, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow, he'll finally be free. But before we get to that moment, you won't believe what happens in the execution chamber. 90% of you still aren't subscribed. Change that right now, because the next part of this story is absolutely insane. August 10th, 1966. 12:01 a.m. The door to French's cell opens. Two guards escort him down a long corridor toward the execution chamber. His hands are cuffed behind his back. His legs are shackled. He shuffles forward, the chains clinking with each step. Witnesses are already seated in the observation room. Reporters, prison officials, Shelton's widow. They watch through a thick pane of glass as French enters the chamber. The room is small, sterile, and cold. In the center sits the electric chair, a massive wooden throne with leather straps and metal electrodes. French doesn't resist. He sits down calmly, almost eagerly. The guards strap his arms, legs, and chest to the chair. They place a metal cap on his head, connected to wires that lead to a control panel. One guard attaches a wet sponge to the cap to conduct the electricity. French is silent. The warden steps forward, reading the official death warrant. French doesn't listen. He's staring at the witnesses, his eyes cold and unblinking. The warden finishes reading. He asks French if he has any last words. This is the moment French has been waiting for. He looks directly at the reporters, sees their pens poised over their notepads, and smiles. "How about this for a headline?" he says, his voice steady. French fries. A few people gasp. One reporter drops his pen. Shelton's widow starts crying. The warden's jaw tightens. He nods to the executioner, a faceless man standing behind a partition. The executioner flips the switch. 2,000 volts of electricity surge through French's body. His muscles seize. His fists clench. Smoke rises from the cap on his head. The smell of burning flesh fills the chamber. Witnesses look away. Some vomit. But French? In those final seconds before his brain shuts down, he's still smiling. The current stops. French slumps forward, lifeless. A doctor steps in, checks his pulse, and pronounces him dead. Time of death, 12:04 a.m. The entire execution took 3 minutes. But French's final words will be remembered for decades. The witnesses file out in stunned silence. No one speaks. Shelton's widow is escorted away by a victim advocate, her face pale and tear-streaked. Reporters rush to their cars, desperate to call their editors before the morning papers go to print. By sunrise, French fries is a headline in newspapers across the country. Some call it the most disrespectful last words in execution history. Others call it darkly brilliant. French's body is removed from a chamber and taken to the prison morgue. No family claims it. He's buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, alongside dozens of other executed inmates. The guards who knew him are shaken. One later said, "I've seen a lot of executions, but French was different. He wanted it. He enjoyed it." The warden orders a full review of the execution, worried that French's spectacle will inspire copycats. It doesn't. But the story of James French becomes legend. In the weeks following the execution, French's case sparks national debate. Was he mentally ill? Should someone who wants to die be executed? Psychiatrists argue that French's desire for death was a symptom of severe depression, not sanity. Anti-death penalty activists use his case as evidence that the system is broken. "We executed a man who was essentially suicidal," one activist writes. But prosecutors disagree. French murdered 2 people, they argue. He got exactly what he deserved. Shelton's family refuses to comment. They want to move on, to forget. But they can't. French's final words haunt them. Decades later, Shelton's daughter will say, "He turned my father's death into a joke. I'll never forgive him." The case eventually reaches the Supreme Court, cited in arguments about mental competency and the death penalty. But by then, French is long gone. Just another name on a list of executed inmates. James French's execution marks a turning point in how America views the death penalty. His case is taught in law schools, studied by psychologists, and referenced in countless documentaries. Some see him as a victim of a broken prison system that drove him to madness. Others see him as a manipulative killer who gamed the system to get what he wanted. Either way, his legacy is undeniable. In 1972, just 6 years after French's execution, the Supreme Court temporarily halts all executions in the United States, citing concerns about mental competency and cruel punishment. French's case is mentioned in the ruling. When executions resume in 1976, new protocols are put in place to evaluate inmates' mental states. French's story becomes a cautionary tale, a reminder that the death penalty isn't always about justice. Sometimes it's about control, and sometimes the condemned have more power than we think. Today, James French is largely forgotten. Most people have never heard his name, but his final words live on. French fries has been referenced in movies, TV shows, and true crime podcasts. It's become a piece of dark pop culture, a punchline in the most literal sense. The electric chair that killed French is no longer in use. Oklahoma switched to lethal injection in 1977. The execution chamber where he died has been converted into a storage room. Shelton's family has moved on, though his daughter still refuses to speak about French publicly. The guards who witnessed the execution are all dead now. The reporters who covered it have retired. But the story remains. Because James French wasn't just a killer. He was a man who chose his own ending, who turned his execution into a headline, and who proved that even in death, some people refuse to be forgotten. French's case set a legal precedent that's still cited today. Courts now must evaluate whether a defendant is volunteering for execution, essentially giving up their appeals because they want to die. If so, judges can order psychiatric evaluations to determine if the person is mentally competent. This process is known as the French Standard, named after James French himself. Since 1966, over 150 death row inmates have volunteered for execution in the United States. Some, like French, are driven by despair, others by guilt, a few by a desire for notoriety. But thanks to French's case, the legal system now has safeguards in place. Not perfect safeguards, but safeguards nonetheless. French's attorneys, who he fired before his execution, later said they believe he suffered from untreated mental illness. He needed help, not execution, one lawyer wrote. But French never wanted help. He wanted death. And he got it. Modern psychologists who've studied French's case believe he suffered from a combination of antisocial personality disorder and severe depression. His childhood trauma, repeated incarcerations, and lack of social support created a perfect storm of hopelessness. Dr. Sarah Whitman, a criminal psychologist, analyzed French's letters and interviews. He wasn't insane in the legal sense, she wrote, but he had lost all sense of purpose. Prison destroyed him mentally, and he saw execution as the only escape. Other experts disagree, arguing that French's calculated planning proves he was rational. He knew exactly what he was doing, one forensic psychiatrist said. He manipulated the system to get what he wanted. That's not mental illness. That's manipulation. The debate continues. Was French a victim, a monster, or both? The answer depends on who you ask. But one thing is certain. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about punishment, mental health, and the value of human life. James French's story isn't just about one man's death. It's about a system that fails the mentally ill, a society that treats prisoners as disposable, and a justice system that sometimes becomes an accomplice to suicide. French killed 2 people. That's undeniable. But he also spent years suffering in a prison system that offered no rehabilitation, no mental health care, and no hope. By the time he murdered Eddie Shelton, French had already given up on life. The state just made it official. Today, death row inmates have access to better mental health resources, suicide prevention programs, therapy. But the system is still broken. Inmates still languish for decades, waiting for execution dates that may never come. And some, like French, still choose death over life behind bars. The question we have to ask ourselves is this: if someone wants to die, should we grant their wish? Or is execution, even for the willing, still state-sanctioned killing? There's no easy answer. But French's story demands we keep asking. James French died laughing at his own execution, and his final words became a headline that shocked the world. He murdered 2 men, manipulated the system, and turned his death into a spectacle. Whether you see him as a victim or a villain, his story is one of the darkest in death row history. If cases like this fascinate you, you need to check out my video on the most horrific last meals on death row. Trust me, it's even more disturbing than this one. Link is on screen now. Don't forget to subscribe, because I've got more twisted true crime coming your way. And drop a comment. Do you think French got what he deserved, or should the state have refused to execute him? I want to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.